What made them do it, those aged souls in the treacherous 12th century? How did they face unimaginable dangers, hunger and bone-deep weariness, all for a distant sacred promise? Number 7. Dame Isolde of Aquitaine. Dame Isolde of Aquitaine felt the chill deep in her bones even on the warmest days of that year. 1148. Her 83 years had etched lines onto her face, each a testament to a life lived, though not without sorrow. Her husband, Sir Roland, had died 2 decades past, leaving her with their sprawling estate near Bordeaux and a legacy of honorable service to the Duke of Aquitaine. Her children were grown with families of their own, consumed by their own noble duties and court intrigues. Isolde, largely confined to the echoing halls of her manor, felt a different calling. It was not a sudden impulse. For years, the whisper of Santiago de Compostela, the resting place of St. James the Greater, had haunted her waking thoughts. Her maid, a young woman named Elara, often found Isolde staring out of the oriel window, her gaze fixed on the distant Pyrenees, a formidable barrier between her and her spiritual quest. The decision to undertake such a journey was met with a chorus of worried objections from her family. Her eldest son, Lord Elaine, argued vehemently, citing her advanced age, the perilous roads, and the ever-present threat of brigands. He spoke of the bitter cold of mountain passes and the scarcity of clean water. Isolde listened patiently, her hands clasped, her gaze unwavering. She explained that she had made a vow, a quiet promise to St. James in a moment of deep grief following the loss of her youngest grandchild to the sweating sickness. The vow, she said, was not merely a request for healing, but a pledge of devotion, a final testament to her faith before her own earthly journey concluded. Elaine, despite his protestations, eventually relented, understanding the deep spiritual conviction that animated his mother's frail frame. He arranged for a small company of 2 loyal squires, Henri and Gaston, both older and experienced, and a sturdy mule named Bess, to accompany her. Elara, fiercely devoted, insisted on joining, despite Isolde's initial reluctance to expose the young woman to such hardship. The departure from Bordeaux was a somber affair, tinged with a mix of apprehension and quiet hope. The sun, a pale orb in the late autumn sky, cast long shadows, as Isolde, wrapped in thick woolens, settled onto Bess's back. Her small purse contained a few silver coins, a rosary, and a small worn reliquary containing a sliver of wood, said to be from the True Cross, a family heirloom. The first few days were relatively smooth following the well-trodden routes towards the south. They passed through villages where the villagers paused their work to stare at the unusual sight of a venerable lady embarking on such a journey. Isolde nodded to them, a faint smile on her lips, her eyes always scanning the horizon. The squires, Henri and Gaston, maintained a vigilant watch, their swords clanking softly against their saddles. Elara, though often tired, meticulously ensured Isolde's comfort each evening, setting up a small tent and tending to her needs. The journey began to reveal its true harshness. As they moved deeper into the Landes region, a vast expanse of pine forests and sandy heath, the path once clear became indistinct, often disappearing into stretches of boggy ground. Rain, cold and incessant, descended upon them, turning the tracks into muddy rivers. Isolde, despite her discomfort, never complained. Her face, often drawn with fatigue, held an inner serenity that baffled her companions. One evening, as they sought shelter in a dilapidated hovel during a particularly violent storm, Henri expressed his concern. He spoke of turning back, of the dangers ahead in the mountains. Isolde simply shook her head. "We shall press on, Henri," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The path to salvation is rarely smooth." The crossing of the Pyrenees proved to be the most formidable challenge. The thin air bit at their lungs, and the steep rocky trails tested Bess's endurance. Snow early, for the season began to fall, blanketing the peaks in a chilling white. One afternoon, a sudden rockfall, dislodged by the frost, blocked their path, forcing a lengthy detour up a perilous, unmarked incline. Gaston, leading Bess, slipped on a patch of ice, sending a cascade of loose stones tumbling down the slope. Isolde, though steady, on Bess felt the tremor of fear. It was then that a small band of armed men, their faces obscured by hoods, emerged from the mist-shrouded pines. They were bandits, notorious for preying on pilgrims. Henry and Gaston drew their swords, ready to defend their lady. Isolde, however, lifted a hand. She slowly reached into her purse and pulled out the small reliquary, holding it aloft. The bandits, momentarily startled by the sight of the frail old woman and the sacred object. Their leader, a brutish man with a scarred face, stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. Isolde spoke, her voice clear, despite the mountain wind. She told him of her vow, of her journey to St. James, and of the sacredness of her purpose. She offered him the few silver coins she carried, not as ransom, but as an offering for his soul. The bandit leader stared at her for a long moment. Then, to the surprise of Henri and Gaston, he lowered his weapon. He took the coins, then gestured for his men to step aside, allowing the pilgrims to pass. He said nothing more, merely watched as they slowly moved past the rockfall. The incident, recorded in a later monastic account of the pilgrimage route, spoke of a remarkable spiritual presence that seemed to emanate from the old noblewoman. Days blurred into weeks. Isolde's strength, though fragile, remained. She ate sparingly, often giving her portion to Alara or the squires, insisting she needed less. Her nights were often restless, filled with coughs and the aches of old age, yet each morning she rose with the same quiet determination. They passed through Navarre, stopping at small hospices run by monastic orders. The hospices, often simple stone buildings, provided warmth, a meager meal, and a straw mat for rest. In one such hospice near Roncesvalles, Isolde encountered a group of younger pilgrims, robust men and women, who expressed their admiration for her fortitude. They shared stories of their own journeys, of close calls with wolves and dishonest innkeepers. Isolde listened, her eyes thoughtful, offering a quiet prayer for their safe passage. As they approached the plains of Castile, the weather turned milder, but new challenges arose. The land was drier, water sources scarcer, and the sun beat down with surprising intensity. Isolde's skin, already weathered, became parched. Her mouth felt like dust. Henri and Gaston spent hours searching for wells, often finding them dry or contaminated. One afternoon, Isolde collapsed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Fear gripped her companions. Alara cradled her head, weeping. Gaston, desperate, spotted a distant shimmer on the horizon, a small cluster of trees. He rode towards it, finding a trickling spring barely more than a puddle. He returned with a flask of the precious liquid which Isolde slowly sipped. The simple act of hydration, a basic human need, felt like a miracle. She revived slowly, her eyes fluttering open, and with a faint smile she whispered a prayer of thanks. This moment of extreme vulnerability and subsequent recovery reinforced for her companions the depth of her resolve. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, they saw the spires of Santiago de Compostela. The sight brought tears to Alara's eyes, and a profound sense of relief to Henri and Gaston. Isolde, however, remained outwardly calm, her gaze fixed on the cathedral. The city was a bustling hub of pilgrims from across Europe, their faces etched with similar stories of hardship and hope. The air vibrated with anticipation and the murmur of prayers. Isolde dismounted from Bess, refusing assistance, and slowly, deliberately, walked the last few paces towards the cathedral doors. The interior was vast, filled with the scent of incense and the hushed reverence of countless souls. She knelt before the high altar, her body trembling slightly, and closed her eyes. She remained there for a long time, her lips moving in silent prayer. The precise words of her vow, the depths of her gratitude, remained unspoken. The purpose of her journey had been fulfilled. The return journey was in many ways just as arduous. Isolde's physical strength seemed renewed. For a time, a fleeting energy that allowed her to face the road once more. They traveled at a slower pace, seeking out hospices and small villages for rest. The season had changed to winter, bringing with it biting winds and occasional blizzards. Isolde, however, carried a newfound lightness in her step, a quiet contentment that seemed to emanate from her. She spoke little of her experience in Santiago, only that her vow had been honored. Back in Bordeaux, Lord Ella, his face etched with worry, rushed to greet her. He was astonished to see her thinner and more fragile, but with an unmistakable glow in her eyes. Isolde lived for another 2 years after her return, often seated by the fire, her hands busy with needlework, her gaze often drifting to the window as if still tracing the long, difficult path to Santiago. Her journey, a testament to her unwavering faith, was quietly remembered in the family chronicles as a remarkable act of devotion. Number 6. Brother Theron. Brother Theron of the Benedictine Abbey of Saint Victor on the outskirts of Paris had served God for 70 years. His skin was like parchment, stretched taut over prominent bones, and his fingers, gnarled with age and years of copying manuscripts, often trembled when he held his quill. He was 81 years old in the year 1197, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath for the new millennium. Still a few years away. For the past decade, Theron had been largely confined to his cell, the rheumatism in his knees making it agonizing to move. Yet a restlessness, a deep spiritual yearning stirred within him. He had heard tales of the Holy Land since childhood, of Jerusalem, the very ground trodden by Christ. His youthful dreams of joining a crusade had long faded, replaced by the quiet rhythm of monastic life. But now, in his old age, a different form of pilgrimage called to him. A journey not of conquest, but of profound humility. Theron had in his youth committed a grave transgression, a moment of weakness and anger that had led to an irreparable rift with his family and a lifetime of quiet penance. While he had confessed and received absolution from his abbot many times over, a part of him felt that only by touching the sacred earth of Jerusalem could he truly find ultimate peace. He did not speak of this to his fellow monks, preferring to carry his burden in silence. He simply approached Abbot Gerard, his superior, with a formal request to undertake a pilgrimage. Abbot Gerard, a man of profound wisdom, listened carefully, his eyes discerning the quiet determination in Theron's voice. He knew Theron's history, though not the details. He knew of the monk's profound piety and years of unwavering service. Despite the obvious physical challenges, the abbot granted his permission, providing Theron with a small purse of coins, a letter of introduction to other monastic houses along the route, and the blessing of the abbey. Brother Julian, a younger strong monk known for his patience and navigational skills, was assigned to accompany him. The journey began in early spring. Theron, clad in his coarse wool habit, walked with the aid of a stout wooden staff, his progress slow and deliberate. Brother Julian, laden with a modest pack containing bread, cheese, a water skin, and a few medical supplies, kept a watchful eye on his aged companion. Their route would take them across France, through the Alps, down the Italian peninsula, and then by ship from a port city like Brindisi or Venice. The first leg of their journey through the familiar landscapes of France was a mix of quiet contemplation and physical exertion. Theron, despite his slowness, insisted on walking as much as possible, refusing to be carried unless absolutely necessary. He found strength in the rhythmic movement of his feet, however painful. They sought shelter each night in monasteries and hospices, presenting their letters of introduction. The hospitality was always generous, the monks often awed by Theron's determination. In one Benedictine house in Burgundy, Theron spent an entire night in prayer before a reliquary, his face illuminated by flickering candlelight, a silent testimony to his unwavering focus. The crossing of the Alps was a brutal test. Even in spring, patches of snow lingered on the higher passes, and the wind howled through the narrow valleys. The rocky trails were treacherous, and the air grew thin, making every breath a struggle. Theron, his breath ragged, often had to pause, leaning heavily on his staff, his eyes closed. Brother Julian, strong as an ox, sometimes had to support him, offering a steadying arm. One afternoon, a sudden, blinding snowstorm descended upon them, reducing visibility to mere feet. They lost the path, stumbling blindly through the swirling flakes. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through even Theron's calm demeanor. "Julian," his voice strained, called out. But the wind swallowed his words. Theron, leaning against a large boulder, began to recite the Psalms, his voice thin but steady. As if in answer to his prayer, a faint bell chime reached them through the storm. It was the bell of a small, isolated mountain hospice, miraculously close. They stumbled towards the sound, finding refuge in warmth, a miracle in the midst of the freezing chaos. This incident, later recounted by Brother Julian, highlighted the profound conviction that seemed to guide Theron through impossible circumstances. Down into Italy, the climate changed, but the challenges remained. Bandits, though less frequent on major pilgrimage routes, were still a threat. In the Apennines, they encountered a group of men who eyed their meager possessions with predatory intent. Brother Julian, a man of peace but strong build, placed himself protectively before Theron, his hand on his stout staff. Theron, however, simply fixed his gaze on the men, his eyes holding no fear. Only a quiet, unwavering solemnity. He spoke, not of God's wrath, but of their sacred journey of the holy ground they sought. The men, unnerved by the old monk's composure, eventually melted back into the shadows without incident. It was not a show of force, but a profound moral authority that diffused the tension. Reaching Brindisi, a bustling port city on the Adriatic coast, was a relief, but also a new set of difficulties. The docks teemed with merchants, sailors, and crusaders. A cacophony of languages and competing interests. Finding passage on a ship bound for the Holy Land proved difficult. Many captains were wary of taking an elderly passenger, fearing he would not survive the voyage, or worse, die at sea bringing bad luck. Theron and Julian spent days negotiating, presenting their letters, explaining their pilgrimage. Finally, a merchant ship, bound for Acre with a cargo of timber, agreed to take them on as extra hands for a small fee. After seeing Theron's unwavering resolve, the journey across the Mediterranean was rough. The small ship tossed by storms was no comfortable conveyance. Theron, though often seasick, spent his days on deck, gazing at the vast expanse of water, his hands clasped in prayer. He bore the cramped quarters, the meager food, and the constant rocking of the waves with quiet endurance. The sailors, initially dismissive, began to show a grudging respect for the old monk, who seemed to find peace even in the midst of a gale. After weeks at sea, the sight of the Holy Land's coastline, even from a distance, filled Theron with a profound sense of awe. Acre, a bustling port city, was their landing point. From there, the final leg of the journey to Jerusalem was still fraught with peril. The region was a mosaic of crusader castles and Muslim territories, often in a state of uneasy truce or open conflict. They joined a small caravan of merchants and other pilgrims, relying on the safety of numbers. The desert heat was intense, the sun relentless, and the scarcity of water a constant worry. Theron, weakened by the long journey, stumbled frequently. Brother Julian, ever watchful, often had to carry him on his back for short stretches. The physical strain was immense. Theron's cough worsened, and his breaths grew shallower. One night, as they rested in a wadi, a dry riverbed, Theron spoke of his past, of the transgression that had led him to seek God's mercy. He did not seek forgiveness from Julian, but merely narrated the story as if unburdening his soul to the desert air. Julian listened in silence, his heart filled with compassion for the old monk's lifelong penance. Finally, the walls of Jerusalem rose before them, ancient and imposing. The sight for Theron was overwhelming. He dismounted, refusing any aid, and began to walk slowly, deliberately towards the city gates. His face, though gaunt, held an expression of profound spiritual fulfillment. He entered the city, its narrow, crowded streets, a dizzying maze of sounds and smells. He made his way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the traditional site of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Inside, the air was thick with incense and hushed prayers of pilgrims from every corner of the known world. There knelt, his old body trembling, before the sepulchre. He remained there for hours, lost in silent contemplation. He simply was present, a soul at last at peace, on the most sacred ground. What transpired within him, what weight lifted from his shoulders, remained a private matter. Brother Julian, watching from a respectful distance, saw only a profound stillness descend upon his old companion. The return journey, like Isolde's, was marked by its own difficulties, but Theron faced them with a quiet joy that seemed to sustain him. He was weaker, certainly, but his spirit was robust. He had reached his goal, fulfilled his vow. He returned to the Abbey of St. Victor a few months later, thinner, paler, but with an unmistakable light in his eyes. The monks gathered silent and reverent as he made his way to the chapel, where he knelt before the altar, offering a prayer of thanks. Brother Theron lived for another year after his return, spending his days in quiet contemplation, his hands often holding a small pouch of dust he had brought back from Jerusalem, a tangible link to the sacred earth. His pilgrimage, an extraordinary feat of endurance and faith in the twilight of his life, became a quiet legend within the abbey, a testament to the unyielding spirit of a man who sought forgiveness and found peace on the world's most hallowed ground. Number 5. Master Alaric the Weaver. Master Alaric a Weaver, from the bustling city of Rouen, had lived a life of quiet industry. He was 68 years old in the year 1235, an age considered venerable by most. His hands, once nimble and strong, capable of intricate patterns on the loom, now bore the stiffness of advanced arthritis. For years a persistent cough had plagued him, growing worse with each winter. His wife, Alara, long since departed, had been laid to rest in the parish churchyard, and their children had moved to distant towns, drawn by the promise of trade. Alaric found himself alone in his small, dusty workshop, the rhythmic clatter of the loom often broken by his own labored breathing. The local physician, a man of limited remedies, had offered tinctures and poultices, but the cough only deepened. Alaric felt a profound sense of his own mortality pressing upon him. He had heard tales of the miraculous healings at the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury. Pilgrims from all corners of England, and even the continent, spoke of the sacred water, the holy relics, and the powerful intercession of the martyred archbishop. For Alaric, a simple craftsman, such a journey seemed an impossible undertaking. He possessed little wealth, his savings just enough for his meager daily needs. But as his breath grew shorter and his nights more restless, a desperate hope ignited within him. It was a faint spark fueled by despair and a yearning for life, a final prayer for reprieve. He knew the journey was long across the English Channel and through unfamiliar English lands. He spoke of his desire to his neighbor, a kindly baker named Thomas, who listened with a sympathetic ear. Thomas, knowing Alaric's quiet piety, helped him sell a few finished bolts of cloth at a reduced price, raising enough coin for the journey. Alaric packed a few changes of clothing, a small loaf of bread, a piece of hard cheese, and a wooden staff. His most treasured possession, a small worn Bible, was tucked securely inside his tunic. The departure from Rouen was inconspicuous. No grand retinue, no family farewells. Alaric simply closed the door to his workshop, locked it, and began his slow walk towards the port of Dieppe. The salty air of the coast was a stark contrast to the familiar dust of his loom. He found passage on a small, cramped fishing vessel, its hold smelling of fish and brine, bound for Dover. The crossing was rough, the English Channel notoriously tempestuous. Alaric, huddled with other passengers, felt the cold spray of the waves and the violent pitching of the boat. He was desperately seasick, his old body racked with tremors. He spent most of the voyage leaning over the side, his weakened lungs struggling against the nausea. The thought of turning back flickered in his mind, but then the image of his loom, silent and waiting, spurred him onward. He landed in Dover, pale and exhausted, but still moving. The English roads were different from those in France, sometimes better maintained, sometimes worse. Alaric, relying on the charity of strangers and the occasional cheap lodging at a local inn, began his slow progress towards Canterbury. He walked at a snail's pace, his staff clanking against the stony path. His cough, exacerbated by the damp English air, often erupted into violent spasms, leaving him breathless and weak. He encountered many fellow pilgrims, younger and more robust, who passed him by with sympathetic glances. Some offered him a piece of bread or a sip of water. Alaric accepted their kindness with a nod and a quiet "thank you." He did not speak much of his purpose, only that he sought the blessing of St. Thomas. One cold, rainy afternoon, as Alaric trudged through a muddy lane, he stumbled, his foot catching on a loose stone. He fell heavily, his head striking the ground with a sickening thud. Darkness enveloped him. He awoke to the touch of gentle hands. He was in a small, humble cottage, and a woman, her face kind and weathered, was bathing his forehead with a damp cloth. She was a widow, she explained, who had found him unconscious by the roadside. She gave him warm broth and a clean, dry blanket. Alaric stayed for 2 days, recovering his strength. The woman, whose name was Martha, asked him about his journey. He told her of his cough, of his hopes for healing. Martha, a woman of deep faith, listened without judgment. She said little, but her quiet kindness was a balm to Alaric's weary soul. When he rose to leave, Martha gave him a small carved wooden cross, telling him to hold it when his spirits faltered. This encounter, a simple act of human compassion in a harsh world, provided Alaric with a profound sense of connection and reinforced his belief in the good that existed. As he continued his journey, Alaric found himself drawn to the rhythm of walking. The small victories of each mile covered, he learned to conserve his strength, to find shelter in the lee of a stone wall during a sudden downpour, to listen for the sound of a nearby stream. His mind, once plagued by worries of his illness, now focused on the immediate tangible reality of the road. He felt a connection to the land, to the trees, to the small creatures that darted across his path. He encountered groups of wandering minstrels, peddlers, and other travelers, each with their own stories. He listened more than he spoke, observing the tapestry of medieval life unfolding around him. He slept in the open air when no other shelter could be found, huddling under a thick cloak, the stars his only companions. The cold bit at his bones, but the vastness of the night sky filled him with a sense of wonder. Days turned into weeks, and Alaric, though physically diminished, felt a growing sense of spiritual resolve. He was no longer just a sick man seeking a cure. He was a pilgrim, part of a timeless procession. He saw other pilgrims with similar ailments, some with worse, and he felt a quiet camaraderie with them, an unspoken understanding of their shared purpose. He passed through small market towns, the scent of roasting meat and freshly baked bread, a tantalizing distraction. He would often pause to watch the local life, the farmers bringing their goods to market, the children playing in the streets, the blacksmith's hammer clanging in rhythm. These small moments of everyday existence, seen through the lens of his pilgrimage, seemed imbued with a new significance. Finally, the spires of Canterbury Cathedral rose into view. The sight filled Alaric, not with a sudden burst of energy, but with a profound and quiet sense of arrival. He walked the last few miles with a deliberate pace, his breath coming in shallower gasps, but his eyes fixed on the magnificent edifice. The city of Canterbury teemed with pilgrims, their faces a mixture of anticipation and weariness. Alaric made his way through the bustling streets, following the flow of the crowd towards the cathedral. He entered the vast, echoing space, the air cool and hushed. The tomb of St. Thomas Becket was a focal point of reverence, surrounded by flickering candles and the hushed whispers of prayers. Alaric knelt, his old knees protesting, and pressed his hands together. He remained there for a long time, his eyes closed, his thoughts a private communion. He did not feel a sudden miraculous surge of health. His cough, though momentarily subdued by the solemnity of the place, still lingered. But something else had shifted within him. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that transcended his physical ailments. He had journeyed far, endured much, and had reached his goal. The purpose of his pilgrimage, whether for physical healing or something deeper, had been fulfilled. Alaric spent a few days in Canterbury, visiting the various shrines within the cathedral. Reflecting on his journey, he bought a small lead ampulla, a souvenir containing a drop of the holy water to bring back to Rouen. The journey back was in many ways easier, not because his physical condition had improved, but because his spirit felt lighter. He faced the challenges of the road with a calm acceptance, a quiet joy in the mere act of living. He arrived back in Rouen several weeks later, his small workshop still locked exactly as he had left it. His neighbor, Thomas the baker, was surprised to see him, having harbored little hope for his return. Alaric, though gaunt and frail, carried himself with a quiet dignity. He returned to his loom, his hands, though still stiff, finding a new rhythm. His cough remained a constant companion, but it no longer held the same terror. Master Alaric lived for another year and a half weaving, slowly, purposefully, his days marked by the quiet hum of his loom and the faint scent of the holy water from Canterbury. His journey, a testament to hope and resilience in the face of mortal illness, became a quiet story, whispered among the artisans of Rouen. Number 4. Agnes the midwife. Agnes, the midwife of the small village of Grainville, had brought countless lives into the world over her 72 years. She had seen joy and sorrow, life and death, often holding a trembling hand as a new soul took its first breath, or a fading one breathed its last. It was the year 1289, and a profound weariness had settled upon her. Not just the physical exhaustion of her work, which often meant long nights and arduous journeys to distant farms, but a deeper spiritual fatigue. Years ago, during a particularly difficult birthing, a young mother and her child had both perished, despite Agnes's tireless efforts. The village, though understanding, had whispered of ill fortune, and Agnes, despite her deep faith, had carried a silent burden of guilt, a sense that she had somehow failed. She had long sought a way to unburden her soul, to find a solace that no confessor or local priest could fully provide. Her answer came in the form of a dream, a vivid vision of the Black Madonna of Rocamadour, perched high on a cliff face in the distant region of Crécy. The shrine was known for its miracles, its powerful intercession, particularly for women and children. Agnes knew the journey would be long and perilous for a woman of her age alone. Her daughter Isolde, a woman of her own middle years, pleaded with her mother to stay, citing the dangers of the road, the lack of companionship, the rough terrain. Agnes listened, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. She explained her burden, her need for this journey, a pilgrimage of penance and profound hope. She had to ask for forgiveness, not from God but for herself, to find peace for the souls she could not save. Isolde, seeing the unyielding determination in her mother's gaze, finally relented, though with a heavy heart. She prepared a sturdy walking stick for Agnes, packed her a small satchel with dried meat, a few crusts of bread, and a small purse containing her meager savings. Agnes carried no reliquary, no letters of introduction, only her faith and her grief. Agnes set out at dawn, walking with a steady if slow pace, her worn leather boots crunching on the dusty path. She was a familiar sight in Grainville, and villagers paused their morning chores to offer quiet blessings. The first few days were relatively uneventful, walking through familiar forested paths and small hamlets. She sought shelter each night in barns, or with kindly villagers offering her knowledge of herbal remedies, or a few stitches for torn cloth in exchange for a warm corner and a handful of straw. She learned to ration her food carefully, making the meager portions last. She often encountered other pilgrims, mostly younger couples or families, who offered a sympathetic glance or a shared meal. Agnes, a woman of few words, but keen observation, would not her eyes taking in their weary faces, their hopeful smiles. The journey south, through the heart of France, revealed its inherent dangers. The roads were often lonely, shadowed by dense forests, rumored to harbor outlaws. One afternoon, as Agnes walked through a particularly secluded stretch of woodland, she heard the heavy thud of hooves approaching from behind. Two men, rough-looking and armed, quickly surrounded her. Their intentions were clear. They sought her purse. She held her walking stick tightly, her eyes fixed on the men. She spoke, her voice surprisingly steady, not of defiance but of her purpose. She told them she was a midwife on a pilgrimage of penance to Rocamadour, and that her purse contained barely enough for her journey, certainly not enough to tempt them. She explained simply that she carried a greater burden than any earthly gold. The men, perhaps surprised by her composure and her unusual story, hesitated. Their leader, a man with a rough beard and suspicious eyes, looked at her for a long moment. He saw, not fear, but a quiet desperation. He then, with a curt gesture, waved his companion away, and they rode off as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Agnes standing alone in the silent woods. The incident, though terrifying, left Agnes with a strange sense of affirmation, as if her sacred purpose had offered her an invisible shield. As she moved deeper into the countryside, the terrain grew more challenging. The paths became stony and uneven, often winding through hills and shallow valleys. The weather turned, bringing with it a succession of cold, heavy rains that soaked her to the bone. Agnes, prone to chills in her old age, felt the creeping onset of fever. She found herself in a small remote village. Her strength failing, she stumbled into a humble church seeking refuge. The local priest, seeing her distress, took her in. He was a simple man, but kind. Agnes, shivering, told him of her pilgrimage and her ailment. The priest, drawing on local knowledge, prepared a warm herbal decoction and allowed her to rest in a small dry room beside the sacristy. Agnes slept for 2 days, battling the fever. During her recovery, she confided in the priest her lifelong burden concerning the young mother and child. The priest, after listening patiently, reminded her that life and death were in God's hands, and that her tireless efforts had been an act of profound compassion, not a failure. His words, simple and direct, offered a glimmer of the peace she sought. This quiet absolution offered by a stranger in a remote village resonated deeply within her. After a week, Agnes, though still weak, felt strong enough to continue. She thanked the priest, and with a renewed sense of purpose, set out once more. The landscape became more rugged, dominated by rocky outcrops and winding river valleys. She often found herself walking for hours without seeing another soul. The silence broken only by the chirping of cicadas or the distant bleating of sheep. She felt a profound connection to the earth, to the rhythm of her own footsteps. Her journey became a walking meditation, each step a prayer, each breath a petition for forgiveness and peace. She learned to forage for wild berries and edible roots when her provisions ran low, drawing on a lifetime of knowledge of the natural world. She learned to read the signs of the weather, seeking shelter before a storm broke. She developed a resilience that belied her frail frame. Finally, after weeks of arduous travel, Agnes saw the dramatic silhouette of Rocamadour. The small village, its buildings clinging precariously to the sheer cliff face, dominated by the towering sanctuary, was a breathtaking sight. The path leading up to it was a series of steps carved into the rock, steep and demanding. Agnes, her breath coming in ragged gasps, began the ascent. Each step was a deliberate act of will, her old muscles burning. She passed other pilgrims, some ascending on their knees as an act of extreme penance. Agnes simply walked, her eyes fixed on the shrine above. She reached the top, her body trembling, but her spirit unbowed. The sanctuary was smaller than the great cathedrals, but it held a powerful, intimate aura. Inside the famed Black Madonna, an ancient wooden statue, darkened by centuries of devotion, sat enthroned. Agnes knelt before her, her hands pressed together, her head bowed. She remained there for a long time, her lips moving in silent prayer, tears tracing paths down her weathered cheeks. She did not ask for a miracle, for the dead to be restored. She simply offered her sorrow, her guilt, her tireless efforts, and her profound desire for peace. What transpired within her remained a private moment. She felt a profound sense of release, a burden lifted that had weighed on her for years. The purpose of her pilgrimage to find solace for her soul had been fulfilled. Agnes remained in Rocamadour for a few days, attending services and finding quiet moments of contemplation. She felt no sudden rejuvenation of her body. Her aches and pains remained, but her spirit felt unburdened. She bought a small lead pilgrim's badge, a tiny effigy of the Black Madonna, to wear upon her cloak. The return journey was slower, more contemplative. She was thinner, certainly, but carried herself with a renewed dignity. She sought out familiar faces along the way. The kind priest who had sheltered her, the baker who had helped her. She returned to Grainville several weeks later, a quiet figure entering the village at dusk. Her daughter Elodie rushed to embrace her, tears streaming down her face. Agnes, though weary, offered a faint smile. She returned to her midwife duties, her hands still trembling sometimes, her cough still present, but there was a difference in her eyes, a quiet light that spoke of a deep inner peace. She still brought lives into the world, still witnessed death, but she carried her burdens with a newfound grace. Agnes lived for another 3 years, a testament to her spirit, her pilgrimage a silent story of a woman who sought to heal her own heart. Number 3. Sir Reginald of Wessex. Sir Reginald of Wessex, once a formidable knight, a veteran of numerous campaigns in the Holy Land, found himself a man adrift in his 75th year. It was 1187, a year that would forever echo with the news of the catastrophic Battle of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin. Reginald, living in quiet retirement on his small estate, had hung up his sword 2 decades prior, his body too scarred, his spirit too weary for further combat. But the news of Jerusalem's fall struck him like a physical blow. He had fought there, bled there, seen comrades fall beneath its walls. He had carried the guilt of battles won and lost, of lives taken, of the harsh necessities of war. He had sought absolution from priests, had endowed monasteries, had tried to live a righteous life, but the images of the holy city now in Muslim hands brought forth a fresh wave of despair, a sense of unfinished business, a profound yearning to return not as a warrior but as a penitent. His remaining family, a few distant cousins, thought him mad. They spoke of the impossibility of such a journey for a man of his age, of the hostile lands, of the very real danger of enslavement or death at the hands of Saracens. Reginald listened, his gaze fixed on the worn-out hilt of his old sword, propped in a corner of his study. He felt a spiritual imperative, a need to seek forgiveness on the very soil where he had shed so much blood, to pray for the souls of those he had killed, Christian and Muslim alike. He had accumulated a modest amount of wealth, enough to fund a final, desperate voyage. He dismissed the idea of a large retinue, choosing instead to travel with a single, loyal former squire, Thomas, a man of 50, who had served him for 30 years, and who, despite his reservations, understood his old master's conviction. Reginald exchanged his armor for a simple tunic and cloak, and his sword for a sturdy wooden staff. He carried a small pouch of gold and a worn crusader's cross, a memento from his younger days. They departed from his modest manor in Dorset, the coastal winds biting at their faces. Their destination was Venice, the great maritime republic, from which ships regularly departed for the Levant. The overland journey across England, and then through France and Italy, was arduous. Reginald, though once a man of immense physical strength, found his body protesting every step. Old wounds, particularly a spear wound in his side that had never truly healed, ached constantly. His old bones groaned with every movement. Thomas, ever vigilant, helped him onto the back of a sturdy pony when the pain became unbearable, though Reginald insisted on walking as much as possible, as if seeking to earn his pilgrimage with each painful step. They avoided major towns, seeking out quieter routes, sleeping in humble inns or under the stars. Reginald, accustomed to the finest chambers, now found solace in the simplicity of the road. The crossing of the Alps was a reminder of the relentless indifference of nature. The mountain passes, even in summer, could be treacherous. Reginald, who had once led men through burning deserts, found himself struggling to breathe in the thin mountain air. A sudden blizzard caught them high on a pass, forcing them to huddle under a rocky overhang, the wind whipping at their cloaks. Thomas, ever resourceful, managed to start a small fire with dried moss and twigs, offering a small measure of warmth. Reginald, his face etched with fatigue, closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. He reflected on the countless lives lost in his past, the faces of young men, both friend and foe, flashing through his mind. This physical hardship, he felt, was a small penance for the weight on his soul. This moment of extreme vulnerability, exposed to the raw power of nature, underscored the profound human element of his quest. Down into Italy, they found the roads filled with other pilgrims, merchants, and a scattering of returning crusaders, their faces grim. The journey to Venice was long, the heat of the Italian plains oppressive. Reginald, accustomed to the cooler climes of England, found himself constantly parched. They relied on local wells, often finding them dry or tainted. One afternoon, Reginald collapsed by the side of the road, overcome by the heat and dehydration. Thomas, frantic, shaded him with his cloak and hurried to a nearby stream, bringing back water in his cupped hands. Reginald slowly revived, his old eyes fixed on the blue sky. He was not afraid of death, he told Thomas, only of dying before he had made amends. Venice, a bustling port city, was a chaotic jumble of smells, sounds, and languages. Finding passage to the Holy Land was challenging. With Jerusalem in Muslim hands, pilgrim traffic had dwindled, and ships were more scarce. Many captains were reluctant to take an old man who seemed barely able to walk. Reginald, despite his frailty, carried himself with an undeniable air of quiet authority, a ghost of the knight he once was. He sought out an old merchant, a man he had known in his younger days, who, out of a sense of past loyalty, arranged passage on a small trading vessel bound for Acre, still in Crusader hands. The journey across the Mediterranean was lengthy and often rough. Reginald, accustomed to the role of a warhorse, found the constant pitching of the ship unsettling. He spent his days on deck, gazing at the vast expanse of sea, his mind filled with memories of past voyages, of the hopes and ambitions of a young knight, now replaced by a quiet longing for peace. Landing in Acre, a Crusader stronghold, was a strange experience. The city, though under Christian control, felt different, altered by the recent defeats. The air was heavy with unspoken tension. From Acre, the journey to Jerusalem was impossible, as it was deep within Saladin's territory. Reginald knew this before he departed. His pilgrimage was not to reclaim the city, but to come as close as possible to pray for its recapture, and to seek spiritual solace for his past actions. He chose instead to make a pilgrimage to Nazareth, the birthplace of Christ, a site still accessible to Christian pilgrims under certain conditions. The road to Nazareth was still dangerous, passing through areas of disputed control. They joined a small caravan of merchants and a few brave Franciscan friars. The threat of ambush was constant. One day, a small skirmish erupted between the caravan guard and a band of raiding Bedouins. Reginald, despite his age, instinctively reached for a weapon. Thomas, however, placed a hand on his arm. Reginald slowly lowered his hand, his eyes observing the chaos with a new perspective. No longer a warrior, but a witness. They reached Nazareth, a quiet village nestled in the hills. The Church of the Annunciation, built over the traditional site of the Virgin Mary's house, offered a sense of profound peace. Reginald knelt within its hallowed walls, his head bowed, his old hands clasped. He prayed not for victory, not for vengeance, but for peace. Peace for the land, peace for the souls lost in endless conflict, and peace for his own troubled heart. He remained there for hours, lost in silent communion. He recalled the faces of his fallen comrades, but also the faces of the Saracen warriors he had fought, recognizing their shared humanity in the face of death. He did not feel a sudden rush of forgiveness, but a quiet easing of the burden, a sense of having offered his penance on the very soil where so much had transpired. The purpose of his pilgrimage, a quest for spiritual reconciliation, had been fulfilled. Reginald spent a few days in Nazareth, walking through its ancient streets, reflecting on his long life. He visited a small monastery where he shared stories of his youth with the Franciscan friars, speaking not of battles, but of the beauty of the Holy Land. He purchased a small, simple pilgrim's cross carved from olive wood. The return journey was arduous, but Reginald faced it with a quiet resignation. He was weaker, certainly, but his spirit was calm. He carried a new stillness within him, a sense of having completed a profound and necessary task. He arrived back in Dorset many months later, a ghost of the knight he once was, but with an unmistakable light in his eyes. His cousins, surprised by his return, found him changed, quieter, more contemplative. Sir Reginald lived for another year after his return, often found by the sea gazing at the distant horizon, his hands often holding the small olive-wood cross. His pilgrimage, a testament to the enduring power of conscience and the human spirit's capacity for penance and peace, was quietly recorded in the annals of his family as a remarkable act of devotion. Number 2. A Lara the Hermitess. Lara had lived in solitude for over 40 years. A hermitess dwelling in a small, remote cave on the edge of the vast forest of Ardennes. Her only companions were the rustling leaves, the distant call of a cuckoo, and the whispers of the wind. She was 78 years old in the year 1312, her face etched with the wisdom of deep solitude, her hands calloused from collecting herbs and tending her meager garden patch. She had chosen this life of reclusion after a profound spiritual experience, in her youth seeking a closer communion with God, away from the clamor of the world. She rarely saw another human soul, relying on the occasional gifts of bread or dried meat left by a sympathetic forest ranger or a rare lost traveler. Her days were spent in prayer, contemplation, and quiet industry. Then, one autumn morning, a vision came to her. It was not a grand apparition, but a quiet, persistent image of a small, forgotten chapel, half ruined, deep in the mountains of Auvergne, dedicated to Saint Foy. She knew of the saint, a young virgin martyred for her faith, whose relics were said to perform miracles. The vision spoke not of healing or personal gain, but of a spiritual urgency, a profound need for her to carry a message of quiet endurance to a place where faith seemed to falter. The path to Auvergne was hundreds of miles, through treacherous forests, over forbidding mountains, and across unfamiliar lands. For a woman who had lived in isolation for decades, the world beyond her cave was an unknown, intimidating expanse. But the vision was insistent, a divine command that superseded all earthly fears. Lara knew she could not refuse. She spent a week preparing, not for comfort, but for survival. She gathered her few possessions, a coarse wool cloak, small leather pouch containing dried berries and roots, a flint and steel, and a small wooden cross that had been her mother's. She fashioned a sturdy walking stick from a fallen branch. She had no one to bid farewell to, no family to object. She simply emerged from her cave one cold, misty morning, closing the entrance behind her with a large stone, and began her journey into the unknown. The forest, once her sanctuary, now became her first challenge. She had navigated its depths for years, but now, with a specific destination in mind, it felt different, more vast, more untamed. She walked for days, relying on her innate sense of direction and the faint tracks of deer or boar. She encountered no one for the first few days, a silent testament to her solitude. Her first human encounter came after a week, when she stumbled upon a small, isolated farmstead. The farmer, a burly man named Gaspard, and his wife Marie, initially eyed her with suspicion, her wild hair and simple garments marking her as an oddity. Alara, unaccustomed to human interaction, spoke haltingly, explaining her pilgrimage and her need for water. Marie, a woman with a kind heart, offered her a bowl of warm porridge and a corner of their barn for the night. Alara, after decades of silence, found herself struggling to form words to explain the profound spiritual call that propelled her forward. She found herself speaking not of specific miracles, but of the quiet strength that comes from deep faith. Gaspard, observing her quiet dignity, seemed to understand. He showed her the path to the nearest village and warned her of recent bandit activity on the main road. The brief encounter, a moment of unexpected human kindness, was a profound experience for Alara, reminding her of the interconnectedness of humanity. As she moved south, the landscape changed from dense forest to rolling hills. She encountered the difficulties common to all medieval travelers: rough roads, suspicious villagers, meager food. Her feet, accustomed to soft earth, grew sore and blistered on the stony paths. Her body, though surprisingly resilient for her age, ached constantly. She often slept beneath trees, huddled against the cold, her only comfort the small wooden cross clutched in her hand. She ate sparingly, her provisions dwindling quickly. One particularly challenging day, she found herself lost in a labyrinth of winding paths. The sun setting rapidly, panic, a rare sensation for her, began to rise. She knelt, her eyes closed, and surrendered herself to the wilderness. As darkness enveloped her, she heard the distant barking of a dog, a sound that led her to a shepherd's hut where she was offered warmth and a piece of bread. The incident, a moment of profound despair followed by unexpected salvation, reinforced her conviction that her journey was guided by a higher power. The journey through the Auvergne Mountains was the most formidable test. The peaks were stark and unforgiving, the paths narrow and clinging to precipitous drops. The air was thin and cold even in late spring. Alara, accustomed to the gentle slopes of Ardennes, found the ascent brutal. She struggled for breath, her legs trembling with exhaustion. One afternoon, a sudden gust of wind threatened to dislodge her from a narrow mountain ledge. She clung to a sparse bush, her heart pounding. She felt a profound sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Yet she did not give up. She pulled herself forward, inch by painful inch, her mind focused only on the next step. Her decades of physical endurance in solitude had prepared her for this. Finally, after weeks of relentless travel, Alara saw the faint outline of the chapel of Saint Foy, nestled in a hidden valley, its stone walls crumbling, its roof partially caved in. It was even more desolate than she had imagined from her vision. The path leading to it was overgrown, almost swallowed by brambles. Alara, her face streaked with dirt and exhaustion, pushed her way through the undergrowth, her old hands tearing at the thorns. She reached the chapel, its silence profound. Inside, the altar was covered in dust, the few remaining wooden carvings riddled with woodworm. The air was heavy with neglect. This was the place. She knelt before the dilapidated altar, her hands pressed together, her body trembling not from cold, but from the spiritual weight of the moment. She offered her long journey, her solitude, her life, as a testament to faith, a silent prayer for the forgotten chapel, for the souls who might come after her seeking solace. She spoke not in words, but in the deepest parts of her being, a profound offering of endurance and silent devotion. The purpose of her pilgrimage, to bear witness to forgotten faith, had been fulfilled. Alara remained in the ruined chapel for several days, cleaning it as best she could, mending a small part of the roof with branches and mud, bringing a small measure of order to the neglect. She left no sign of herself, no name, only a quiet presence that seemed to linger in the air. She carved a small cross into a stone near the chapel entrance, a silent marker of her visit. The return journey was, in many ways, as challenging as the outward one. She was weaker, certainly, but her spirit felt renewed, fortified by the profound act of obedience to her vision. She felt a quiet joy in her solitude, a deeper connection to the divine. She returned to her cave in the Ardennes months later, a thin, frail figure emerging from the forest mists. She sealed her cave entrance once more, retreating into her chosen life of quiet contemplation. Ilara lived for another 2 years, her presence in the forest a whispered legend among the local villagers, her pilgrimage a testament to profound spiritual obedience and the quiet power of a life lived in unwavering faith, was a silent narrative of enduring conviction. Number 1. Father Benedictus. Father Benedictus, a priest of a remote parish nestled in the desolate fenlands of East Anglia, had served his flock for over 50 years. He was 79 years old in the year 1205, his hair a wispy white halo around a bald pate, his hands gnarled from years of digging graves and tilling the small parish garden. The fens were a harsh mistress, the land prone to flooding, the air thick with damp, and the threat of fever. His parishioners, mostly poor farmers and fishermen, faced constant hardship. A particularly virulent fever had swept through the village the previous winter, claiming many lives, including several children. Benedictus, helpless to stem the tide of death, felt a profound despair. He had prayed, administered last rites, offered what little comfort he could, but the suffering had left a deep mark on his soul. He had heard tales of the miraculous healing waters of Santiago de Compostela, the distant shrine in Spain. While many went for personal absolution, Benedictus felt a different calling. He believed that if he could bring back a phial of the sacred water, blessed by St. James, it might offer solace and perhaps even protection to his ravaged community. It was a desperate hope born of profound love for his flock. He knew the journey was long, perilous, and utterly unprecedented for a man of his age and station. His bishop, consulted by letter, was hesitant, citing the dangers and Benedictus's advanced years, but the old priest's conviction was unyielding. He spoke of his flock's suffering, of his duty to seek any means of spiritual comfort for them. The bishop, moved by his humility and fierce devotion, finally granted permission, providing a small sum of money from the diocesan funds, a letter of introduction, and the blessing of the church. Benedictus chose to travel alone, believing his advanced age would elicit charity, and that a large retinue would only draw attention to his precious cargo. He carried only a simple wooden staff, a small leather satchel containing a few dried provisions, his worn breviary, and the empty glass phial, carefully stoppered and wrapped in cloth. The departure from his small, damp parish church was a quiet affair, witnessed by a handful of tearful parishioners. Benedictus offered them a final blessing, his voice surprisingly strong, then turned and began his slow walk towards the coast. He aimed for the port of Dover, a familiar embarkation point for those traveling to the continent. The first days were grueling. The fenland paths were often waterlogged, and the old priest's feet grew sore and swollen, his breath already shallow often caught in his chest. He relied on the charity of local monasteries and hospices, presenting his letter and explaining his mission. Most were sympathetic, offering a warm meal and a place to rest. He found himself often silent, conserving his energy, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon as if already seeing the spires of Santiago. The crossing of the English Channel was rough, as it often was. Benedictus, crammed into a small open fishing boat, felt the cold spray of the waves and the incessant pitching of the vessel. He was deeply seasick, his old body racked with tremors. He spent most of the voyage leaning over the side, his stomach churning, yet he clutched his empty phial tightly, a constant reminder of his sacred purpose. He landed in Calais, pale and exhausted, but still moving forward. The overland journey through France was a constant test of endurance. Benedictus, accustomed to the flat fens, found the rolling hills and winding rivers of northern France a new challenge. He walked at a slow, measured pace, his staff tapping rhythmically on the path. He ate frugally, often sharing his meager provisions with other less fortunate travelers he encountered. He slept in barns, in ditches, or occasionally in humble village churches, when no other shelter could be found. His worn habit, once pristine, became stained with mud and dust. His face, already lined with age, became gaunt with fatigue. He encountered beggars and vagrants, and though he had little, he always found a crumb of bread or a kind word to offer, seeing in their eyes the same suffering he sought to alleviate in his own flock. One particularly cold night, as Benedictus walked through a dark forest, he heard the chilling howl of wolves. He had heard them before in the fens, but here in the unfamiliar woods, the sound felt more menacing. He quickened his pace, his old heart pounding, but his legs were leaden with exhaustion. He stumbled, falling heavily onto the frozen ground. As he lay there, his breath ragged, he heard the rustling of leaves and the snapping of twigs. He closed his eyes, clutching his wooden staff tightly, ready to face whatever came, but instead of wolves, he heard human voices. A small band of traveling merchants, seeing his distress, helped him to his feet. They had heard the wolves, too, and offered him a place in their camp by a roaring fire. Benedictus, warm and safe, offered a silent prayer of thanks. This unexpected rescue, a moment of human solidarity in a dark and dangerous world, reinforced his belief in the guiding hand of Providence. As he moved further south, the weather grew milder, but the days became longer, the sun more intense. Benedictus's feet, constantly aching, developed painful blisters. He often had to stop, resting by the roadside, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He found strength in the rhythmic recitation of his breviary, his lips moving silently over the Latin prayers. He thought of his parishioners, their faces etched with suffering, and this image fueled his determination. He passed through small villages, their inhabitants curious about the old priest traveling alone. He answered their questions patiently, explaining his sacred mission for his ailing flock. Some offered him a fresh loaf of bread, others a cup of milk, touched by his quiet devotion. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, Benedictus saw the distant spires of Santiago de Compostela. The sight for him was not one of personal triumph, but of profound relief and a sense of having almost fulfilled his mission. He entered the bustling city, a hub of pilgrims from across Europe, and made his way to the cathedral. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of countless prayers. He knelt before the high altar, his old body trembling, and offered a prayer of profound thanks for his safe arrival. He then made his way to the sacred spring from which the miraculous holy water was drawn. With trembling hands, he filled his small glass phial, carefully stoppered it, and wrapped it in a piece of clean linen. The weight of the phial in his hand, a tangible link to the sacred, felt immense. He had endured much, but the physical struggle was nothing compared to the spiritual burden he felt for his suffering community. The purpose of his pilgrimage, to bring a measure of divine solace to his flock, had been fulfilled. Benedictus spent a few days in Santiago, attending services and finding quiet moments of reflection. He spoke to other pilgrims, sharing his story, his simple humility a stark contrast to their often grander narratives of personal penance. He purchased a small pilgrim's shell, the symbol of St. James, which he tied to his staff. The return journey was just as arduous, but Benedictus faced it with a quiet joy, knowing that he carried something precious, something that would bring hope to his beloved parish. He was thinner, certainly, his face more gaunt, but his eyes held a new light, a quiet strength. He arrived back in his Fenland parish many months later, a lone figure emerging from the mists, clutching his staff with the pilgrim's shell and the precious phial. His parishioners, many of whom had given him up for lost, rushed to greet him, their faces a mixture of relief and awe. Benedictus, weary but radiant, slowly made his way to the altar. He carefully unwrapped the phial, pouring a few drops of the sacred water into a chalice. He then administered the blessing to each member of his flock, his voice, though frail, resonating with a profound sense of purpose. He did not claim a miracle, did not promise a cure. He simply offered the sacred water as a symbol of hope, a tangible sign of God's presence and St. James's intercession. The effect on his parishioners was profound. A quiet sense of peace settled over the small community. Father Benedictus lived for another year after his return, a living testament to faith and selfless devotion, his old hands often holding the now empty phial, a powerful symbol of his extraordinary journey. His pilgrimage, an unparalleled act of love for his flock, became a silent legend in the isolated Fenlands, a story of an old priest who walked to the ends of the earth for the sake of his community.